Hi, my name is Patience Blythe Creech, and this is my discussion post for the digital learning class where we're asked to think about how to change professional learning. The second discussion post, in other words, for week 2. This is a presentation that I've been working on over the last several years, and I tweak it and present it, and I thought it really was a starting point for me as we go on this journey of thinking about how to alter professional learning for teachers in schools. So this presentation for me is all about design thinking, and that's really the way that I approach my teaching, is thinking about how to provide opportunities for open-ended learning experiences for students. And for me, with my background, that comes from the intersection of art and design and science. So what I like to say is that art asks questions and design provides solutions. And these concepts I really pull from a person named John Maeda. You can look at his TED Talks. He was the director of RISD for a long time, and he's just a very creative thinker. But I love this explanation of the difference between art and design. And I think that when we think about design and we start to look at our world with a critical eye, and then we start teaching with that same perspective, that's when some magical things happen. So here are two everyday objects. On the left, we have Ray-Ban aviator sunglasses. On the right, we have a rose gold iPhone. Both of these are rather ubiquitous objects. However, the design story behind them is very interesting and sometimes is forgotten in terms of their now daily use. Now, of course, aviator sunglasses were not developed for people to take selfies on Instagram, but they were actually designed for aviators with polarized lenses, and they were designed to minimize the glare that affected pilots' eyes while they were flying over deserts and oceans. So they had a very specific purpose when they were first invented, and now, of course, have become a fashion statement. I actually own a pair myself. I love them. And then on the right, we have our iPhone. Now, we all have an iPhone or a smartphone, and we understand their significance to us. They understand that it's a phone, it's an email device, it checks the internet, it has a flashlight, it takes photos, it connects with our favorite apps. But the reality of the iPhone is that it's really a culmination of many, many years of human technological achievement shrunk down onto a scale that is handheld. And the amazing thing about the iPhone is that it changed the world in terms of democratizing access to the internet and democratizing access to phones and cameras and Instagram and Facebook and all those things. And we can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But the iPhone really combined all these desires that we had to interact with technology in a very small and easy to use object. So both of these objects I find to be very fascinating in terms of their now daily nature. They're not rare, they're not surprising, they're not innovative in a sense now, but of course they were when they first were invented. And they really represent a lot of different ideas than maybe what we give them when we think about it at face value. So part of this week's challenge was to think about ideas, and that the danger of good ideas that don't come out is that they get lost. And I think that that's exactly true. And you think about those designers at Ray-Ban, had they not really thought and really empathized with those pilots, would we have gotten the aviators at the time that we did, when they definitely had a lot to do with the success of Allied pilots in World War II? When we think about the iPhone, Steve Jobs really took a lot of leaps with a lot of his products, and the iPhone definitely was an example of that. And of course, he could see what the iPhone could become, but nobody else really understood it. But it's all about that bravery of bringing apart these ideas and communicating them in meaningful ways, so that people will listen and start to think about, what would that look like in real life? So this is a picture of my classroom from when I taught in inner city Philadelphia. I taught in North Philly in a neighborhood called Ojo de Oro, which is a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, Puerto Rican and Dominican students up in the north side of Philadelphia near Temple University. When I started teaching at this charter school, I taught 6th and 7th graders science. None of the children that I taught had ever had a science class before. You may say that's impossible, but no, it's not. The school district of Philadelphia was pretty famous, infamous for having lots of problems. They had basically gotten rid of all classes except for reading and math a couple years before I got there, and this charter had been founded as a bilingual charter school to serve the students of this specific neighborhood. So I came in and taught them science. Now, it's a problem when you've never learned science and you're 11 years old. And so they had a ton of gaps, and some of the biggest gaps they had were vocabulary. I thought about it. I talked to my friend Karen, who was the art teacher. I said, what am I going to do? And we came to this realization that all students love animals. So we started doing animal of the day. So every day for the rest of the year, I taught these kids a different animal. We looked at their common name, their scientific name. We talked about facts about these animals. And the trick of animal of the day was it was a way to pack vocabulary in a way that was engaging with students. Every kid loves animals. They all wanted to learn about all these animals. They talked about them with other teachers. And it was a really fascinating discovery for me that there are ways to grab kids that maybe are outside the box, but really, really work. And this was back in, 2011. And so it was quite a while ago. But it was sort of really the beginning when I was starting to really start to concretely become aware of how these ideas worked. So this is where it all begins. This is the lady herself. This is me. When I'm probably about 5 years old, I'm sitting in my grandparents' kitchen in the north of England in a town called Formby, just outside of Liverpool. And when we would stay with my grandparents, my grandpa would wake me up early in the morning and bring me downstairs. That's why it's dark. And we would sit at the table and we would talk about all sorts of things. And I learned how to be a good person from my grandfather. He was the best person that I've ever met. And he was very famous in his community and with his daughters, my mom and aunt, daughters' friends, for being a man that you could always go to if you needed anything or needed to talk about anything. He was the definition of solid. And he was so funny and so loving, and we did all sorts of things together. And it just about broke my heart when he died when I was 14. But I really think that a core part of who I am and my approach to the world, which is this open-minded, loving interest in lots of things, really comes from my grandfather. This is where I went to high school at the Academy of Science and Technology. This is what we call a magnet school in Conroe ISD, which is just outside of Houston. And I learned a lot from this school. I was really challenged to do really well. I was in a group of really competitive students. But I really struggled in this environment because of a lack of empathy and understanding on the part of the teachers. These teachers were really motivated by success, academic success, and this idea that the students should achieve and achieve and achieve. But in terms of the connection with their students and an understanding of the fact that kids are different and they may not act or look the way that you think they should, but they still have value. That was really missing from this school. So despite the really high quality of teachers, I would say I learned from this experience that I needed closer relationships with the people that I had these mentoring relationships with. And that really also informed how I became a teacher. I actually ended up leaving the Academy of Science and Technology in my junior year and just went to the regular high school that it was a part of and graduated from Oak Ridge High School. When I was in college, I took a class my freshman year in Jester Hall at the University of Texas at Austin, and it was called Race and Education, and it just sounded interesting to me, so I went ahead and took it. This is when I was actually a photojournalism major, and this was my first real kind of sociology class, and we read this book, Savage Inequalities, and it changed my life. I did not understand how segregation functioned in cities. I didn't understand that different groups of people had different levels of access to things. And I started to think about, well, if people don't have equal access to resources in schools, how can people ever have equal access to anything else? And I started to really dive into segregation. I looked into legislation and policy. I looked into the Civil Rights Act, the difference between de jure and de facto segregation. And I became, for lack of a better word, I became a segregation researcher. And I ended up changing my major. I actually became a major in ethnic and urban studies. And I focused, I had three majors and 2 minors, or it was the other way around, I can't remember. But I ended up focusing on how segregation limited people's access to city services, especially education. And this is actually how I became a teacher, because I realized that the impacts of segregation are so intense and so entrenched in American society that there really wasn't anything I could do about that. But what I could do is I could teach in schools and try to lessen the impacts on the students that were in my classes. And so that's what I did. I also was a Girl Scout for a long time. I was actually a Girl Scout all the way through a Gold Award with my friend Martha, who is my best buddy. And she still is my best buddy to this day. She actually works for the State Department, and she is a manager of an embassy in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, Sierra Leone. That's where she is now. We have been friends since we were 10, and we have been in service also since we were 10 years old, and that informs everything that we do. So this comes to my purpose of this presentation, which is to think about how do we meet our students' needs, but also how do we create a 21st century really meaningful education. And I love to think about this process of understanding, creating, and delivering of ideas. If we understand problems, we can have insight, we can empathize with the people who are experiencing those problems. We can then start to define what those problems might be. And then we can start to ideate, come up with possible solutions. Then we can deliver in terms of developing prototypes, possible solutions. Then we can test them and see if they work. Now, what I find with students is if you teach them this way, the first thing that happens is they ask you how to do it. Then when you tell them that either you don't know or you're not going to tell them, they get frustrated. And then, as long as your problem is really well defined, they begin to create. And at that point, they just go. And as long as you're there to facilitate and help and answer questions, they are going to create work products more true and more based in their own reality than anything you could ever show them, teach them, etc. A lot of times I find in education and in schools, especially in high-stakes testing, we're talking about, we want to meet that accountability rating. We want to win this game of STAR here in Texas. And I just want to encourage us to stop focusing on that. I think our biggest goal needs to be getting rid of being afraid of failing. That comes to teachers and students. We are all so overloaded and overwhelmed by this concept of accountability that we're afraid to innovate in that space. Even though I remember STAR when it first started, because I started teaching before it began, I know that it was supposed to not be something that was a goal. It was supposed to be a sort of a basic minimum standard. When we think about the TEKS have huge latitude if we let ourselves think about them in those terms. But what we have created is a system that is incredibly limiting, totally based on test scores, fearful of failure, and therefore stifling of innovation on the part of the teacher. I want to rethink school in huge fundamental ways. Now, for this presentation, we're not talking about my dreams about how to rethink school in huge fundamental ways. We're talking about how do we influence teachers, how do we change professional learning so it's more meaningful and therefore has more impact for students. I want us to think about this idea from one of my teaching heroes, Dr. Chris Emdin from Columbia University. He says good teaching is gathering all the energy in the cosmos and pulling it into one room just long enough to melt the words being spoken into molecules that are breathed in and not heard. When those words are inhaled deep, they touch the soul. The evidence is in the eyes, always in the eyes. And so I like to close here because what I'm talking about is what I want to focus on from my professional learning presentation is how do we get this to happen in teachers? How do we get teachers to be willing to rethink school? How do we let teachers not be fearful that their ideas are good, that their sense of innovation is powerful? And I think what we do is we start talking and looking and thinking about our ideas. We start to think about our experiences and our history. But most importantly, we start thinking about ourselves as the younger version of ourselves that is passionate, as excited, and is curious. And so my professional learning focus will be on the importance of every year asking teachers, why are you a teacher? Let's talk about it. Let's create professional learning communities around your passions. Let's treat this as an open-ended issue. Let's ask teachers, what are the problems that we face in our schools? Let's come up with creative solutions and let's start to problem solve. And let's treat teachers like the experts that they are, but also the curious and wonderful children that they are at their heart and at their core. Thank you.